Good evening. I'm James Cornelius, curator of the Lincoln Collection here at the Presidential Library and Museum, and we thank you for coming out tonight. Charles Strozier comes to us tonight from a recent reading he did from his new book at New York University in the city where he resides, and he is en route to another appearance here in Springfield tomorrow night at the Isles House, if you don't get enough tonight. That starts at 7 o'clock on a related but not identical topic to tonight's. He has briefly left his family and friends back home for our benefit, and he has just finished teaching his 30th year of history classes at the City University of New York. He is also a full-time psychoanalyst at an institute there in that world capital of the discipline of psychoanalysis. Is it still the world capital? I know Buenos Aires lays claim to it sometimes, and perhaps Paris. But most of this professional work began here in Springfield, where he taught at Sangamon State University for 14 years, right after it opened in 1970. In 1982, Chuck wrote one of the pioneering studies of psychohistory, a book called Lincoln's Quest for Union, Public and Private Meanings. And then, 30 years after that, in a very different vein, he published the book Until the Fires Stopped Burning, 9/11 and New York City in the Words and Experiences of Survivors and Witnesses. On the back of tonight's subject volume, you can read praise from a number of people working in more than one professional field, a rarity for a person reaching this stage in our very Lincoln-centered interest group here. And most writers on the general topic, I would say, of Abraham Lincoln and Joshua Speed, of course, do study the known letters and comments by Lincoln and Speed on one another and on other things. But something that I most appreciated about this new book is how carefully our author tonight read and interpreted all of those letters and comments not by Lincoln or Speed. That is, those by others. That is, building up a picture of their whole social circle, their business and political, legal connections, all of those young women they were discussing, and this burgeoning middle of the nation being developed in part by those two young men and by other free and unfree labor. In both realms, Chuck's readings have, I think, a level of acuity that contributes greatly to the personal and social picture that comes out in this book. But we can ask him a good deal more on that and all other topics tonight. He will be reading a bit and speaking from this podium for a while, and then he and I will sit down over there and we will have an extended period of questions and comments from you, the audience, and he will also be signing more books out front at the end of that. So please welcome Charles Strozier.
Thank you. Thank you, James. It's so generous. And it's just wonderful to be back in Springfield. It's really a homecoming for me. As James said, I was here many years ago, and it was my first job, and it was central for my my own coming of age. And nobody in the writing of this book was more helpful than James Cornelius, who I describe in my acknowledgments as truly a scholar and a gentleman. And when he read the manuscript, he helped me with getting materials when I was doing my research. And when he read the manuscript, he would write dubious in the margin, and he was always right. So the book is infinitely better than it would have been otherwise. As James mentioned, I do combine these two professions of a historian and a psychoanalyst. When I was a young man, I had a rich and varied practice, but my patients were all dead. But for the last 25 years, I've actually developed my own sort of robust psychoanalytic practice, which I think has, it's changed me, but it's also changed some of the ways in which I understand Lincoln. So I will ramble on for a while and try to give a sense of what the book is about, and then we'll have our Charlie Rose moment over there. So Lincoln struggled as a young man with issues of intimacy and depression. He was always moody, but in his late 20s and early 30s, and not later, he was twice clinically depressed and suicidal. First, after the death of his beloved Anne Rutledge in 1835 in New Salem, and then 6 years later after he broke off his engagement with Mary Todd. Now, New Salem was a decidedly uncertain time for young Lincoln. He tried on many masks, from buying a store that winked out, as he put it, because his partner drank himself to death, to two brief stints in the militia chasing Indians to the border of Wisconsin in the Black Hawk War, to some bad surveying, postmaster, farming, and splitting rails, and of course a very slow learning of the law. He was only really successful in his work in the state legislature, and that was part-time. New Salem was a small stage on which he could assume his assigned roles, at which he could afford to fail and grow and learn. He was most unsteady, however, in his uneasy relationship to love and intimacy. And he, after about 1832, he knew Anne Rutledge as soon as he came to the village, but he began to hang around her more after 1832. She had been engaged to somebody else who had left the village, and she didn't feel that she was totally free until about 1834, and they were betrothed. So they'd fallen in love. She was lovely, wonderful young woman, apparently, and then she suddenly died in August of 1835. And it put him into a very severe state of depression. Anne's brother told Herndon that the effect on Mr. Lincoln's mind was terrible. He became plunged in despair, and many of his friends feared that reason would desert her throne. His extraordinary emotions were regarded as strong evidence of the existence of the tenderest relations between himself and the deceased. Mentor Graham told Herndon that Lincoln said he felt like committing suicide often after Anne died. Hardin Bale reported Lincoln was locked up by his friends to prevent derangement or suicide. In other words, they must have set up some kind of suicide watch, because you couldn't lock the doors in the cabin strung along the dirt path in New Salem. But that's really what happened. And Lincoln, I think in general, sort of pulling back a little bit in this period, was a dark despair of uncertain childhood origins lingered in young Lincoln. For the moment, his depression was relatively quiescent, just below the surface. He was in a state of what the psychoanalyst Erik Erikson called a moratorium, that moment in youth when a troubled and often talented young person holds at bay peremptory developmental demands, keeping them dormant and suppressed without being resolved, waiting for a kind of inner transformation that will permit the construction of a usable identity. Erikson stresses that someone in such a developmentally delayed state of tension slows things down, easily slips into, quote, torturous self-consciousness, and most of all recoils from intimacy. The danger in closeness with another is the potential loss of self. For Lincoln, the unconsummated love for Anne Rutledge and then her sudden tragic death brought back in full force the earlier trauma of his mother's death. A suffering young Lincoln fell back on a cover of blandness that allowed some expression of his depression only to those few he trusted. He thus wrote Mary Owens in 1836 from Vandalia that things, quote, have conspired and have gotten my spirits so low that I feel that I would rather be any place in the world than here. He also told his friend William Butler around the same time of his despair at not having a home, of being in debt, and having nothing to look forward to. So Joshua Speed was very definitely to the manner born. His father, John, had built up Farmington just outside Louisville as one of the largest plantations in Kentucky. In 1829, they had 62 slaves, so it was a great big plantation. They grew basically hemp, from which they made the ropes that tied the cotton throughout the South. But it was more like a little village, the way Farmington worked. There were a whole bunch of other younger siblings. Joshua didn't like his father at all. Not at all. He loved his mother, Lucy. He was very devoted to her. But he had gone away to school for a little while and came back, got sick, came home, went back again, got sick again. And at 16, he basically left home. And he went to work in a store in Louisville, about 7 miles away, and lived in the store, was there for a few years, about 4. And then he decided to come to Springfield. And he was part of a move from educated, elite, ambitious young people, men and women, moving from Kentucky at that time toward Illinois, and particularly toward Springfield. So there was a real exodus toward the town. And he arrived and he set up a dry goods store on the west side of the square. So on April 15th, 1837, Lincoln arrived in Springfield to start his new life. He was just a fully certified lawyer. Was going to be the junior partner of John Todd Stewart, the leading lawyer in town. And he walked over to Speed's store. Now, they were clearly acquainted with each other, but they were by no means not. They were not friends. But he walked into the store and he asked Speed sort of how much it would cost to buy the materials for a bed. And Speed calculated, and he said $17. Actually, in another account, he says $34. And Lincoln, very morose, said, "Well, Speed, I wish I could pay that. I wondered if you could give it to me on credit till Christmas. And if this venture with the law works, I should have the money by then. And if not, then nothing will work out for me anyway." Speed said he's never seen anybody quite so morose at the time. And he said, "Look, Lincoln, I stay upstairs, it's a big room, I have a large double bed," that's his phrase, "and why don't you stay with me?" So Lincoln, without a word, picked up his saddlebags, walked up to the room, deposited his saddlebags, and walked downstairs and said, "Well, Speed, I'm moved." Now, they stayed in that room and in that bed for nearly the next 4 years. But I'm sure you've all heard about the gay Lincoln argument. And all the good evidence, I think, argues that it was definitely not a sexualized relationship. And first of all, in that room for 2 years, Herndon, who was a clerk of Speed in the store until he got married, Herndon lived for 2 years and never said anything that was untoward. And of course, the context is the severe prescription of any kind of sex between two men at the time, totally and absolutely forbidden, but encouraging friendship and affection between young men. Quite different from contemporary attitudes. And I think it's different, given attitudes now, it's hard to enter into that time and place and understand these kinds of differing attitudes. But Herndon, so the context is absolutely forbidden any kind of actual sexual contact with the genitals and orgasm. That would be verboten. It was illegal, among other things, and you would have been arrested. So people would never allow that to be known. And Herndon, living in the same room, sleeping in another bed for 2 whole years, never had any inkling that something was wrong. Something untoward was going on, shall we say. And Herndon, of course, was endlessly interested in anything sexual about Abraham Lincoln, about his father, about his mother, and about Lincoln. And I mean, his books and his letters are filled with mostly imagined things about Lincoln's sexuality. Furthermore, there was never anything that anybody ever said in Springfield. No contemporary ever had any kind of rumor. In the entire oral history that Herndon gathered, nobody ever, not once, said anything untoward. Stephen Douglas, who knew Lincoln very well, and I'll talk about this, gathered in the store at nights. They were real partners in the leadership of the young intellectuals and young men in town. In the debates in 1858, was not above finding anything he could come up with to attack Lincoln with. And he called him in the debates a drunkard at different times in different places. He called him a drunkard, a ruffian, a gambler, and a traitor. And he also ran a saloon. Now, he did run a saloon in New Salem, but the others are hardly true. Finally, Lincoln himself talked openly and easily about the fact that he had slept in the same bed with Speed. After he appointed James Speed, Joshua's younger brother, as Attorney General in 1864, he commented, "I will offer it, the cabinet post, to James Speed of Louisville, a man I know well, though not so well as I know his brother Joshua. That, however, is not strange, for I slept with Joshua for 4 years, and I suppose I ought to know him well." It was also not uncommon for men to sleep together. Lincoln, of course, as a child, had that experience with his siblings after the stepmother and the children, her children by the first marriage came to live. Certainly in New Salem, it was constantly for warmth and ease. Men would tumble into bed. Later, that was very common on the circuit. Nevertheless, social history and individual biography are not always congruent. So that just because it was common for men to sleep together at the time, for a variety of reasons, without it being sexualized, doesn't mean that it was of no significance that at the moment of greatest turmoil in young Lincoln's life, at a time that he slept with his best and probably the only really close friend he had in his life for nearly 4 years. The question, of course, becomes, what does it mean? So I argue that in that friendship, Lincoln was saved in a very real sense. These were years he could have gone off the rails psychologically. Now, Lincoln had a way of making his friends feel they were special, which led in large part to the extraordinary male discussion group, if you can call it that yet. Salon doesn't work as a word. There really is no word quite to describe the group of men who gathered in the Speed store in the evenings. And in the winter, they would go to a big fireplace in the back, and they would all gather around and talk about everything under the sun. Everything under the sun. And Speed, in his reminiscences, makes very clear that the reason they came was because of Lincoln, because of his wit, because of his sensibility, because of his wide-ranging interests, and because of his humanity. But all the leading young, ambitious politicians and intellectuals in town came: Edward D. Baker, Orville Browning, John J. Hardin, and a number of other Democrats. They tried to tamp down the political differences. But the most interesting is Stephen Douglas. So in light of the later history, in light of the debates, there they are sitting in the back of Speed's store for several years in front of the fire, arguing about poetry and life and politics. They couldn't totally avoid politics. Psychologically, however, only Speed really mattered to Lincoln. This most shut-mouthed of men, as his law partner Herndon put it, revealed himself in his deepest feelings, confusions, and at times despair only to Speed. Lincoln, who talked of his, quote, old tired eyes, unquote, and was called Honest Old Abe as early as his middle 30s, came to depend on the closeness and empathy of Speed, who intensely admired the humor, intelligence, and basic goodness of his friend. Part of what bound them so closely was their common hesitation, even confusions about intimacy. Both sought love with a woman, but tended to stumble about in that quest. Now, in the winter of 1839-40, Lincoln became infatuated with the sprightly Mary Todd, then 22 years of age, and living with her sister, Elizabeth Edwards, in their gracious home on Quality Hill in Springfield. Or Aristocracy Hill, they sometimes called it. I love this contrast. I develop it at some length in the book. The contrast between the male salon and the Speed store versus this very elegant home on Quality Hill where they played violins and danced, and the Edwardses greeted their guests in French. But Mary was cute and vivacious, well-educated. She spoke fluent French and could recite long poems from memory, and very social. She seemed to him, quote, the very creature of excitement, and he soon fell in love. He was, as Speed said, he was led to call, in fact, on Mary at the very first time by Speed himself, which is an interesting connection there. And at some point that winter or spring, they commenced seeing each other, this is Elizabeth Edwards' phrase, and became engaged. Now, there's been some disagreement in the literature in recent years whether they were actually engaged, but Lincoln, Speed, and Elizabeth Edwards all testify to the broken engagement. Well, you can't break an engagement unless you're actually engaged. And the marriage was planned for January 1, 1841. But in a move that has perplexed historians ever since, Lincoln broke the engagement sometime in the second half of December 1840. All kinds of theories have been offered to explain Lincoln's action, most mutually exclusive. From his supposed sexual love for Speed, to his infatuation with the beautiful Matilda Edwards, who arrived in Springfield in November, to his sense of inadequacy with the lordly Todds, to Mary actually taking the decisive action. The evidence, most of it contradictory, supports none of these theories altogether. And the reason for the broken engagement has remained an enigma for most of the last century and a half. In fact, while books are undoubtedly going to keep being written about Abraham Lincoln, and there will be other speakers at this podium, I'm sure, the story of the broken engagement remains the last area of real disagreement in the field. What actually mattered to Lincoln lay in the shadows of his self-experience, namely the panic Speed's imminent separation posed to his equilibrium. Speed's father had died the previous year, and the family beckoned him to return to Louisville and take charge of the plantation and generally the family affairs. He was the acknowledged leader of the family. And in the late summer of 1840, Speed, having delayed already for most of a year, probably because he didn't want to be separated from Lincoln, but finally he reluctantly decided to go back to Louisville. And he began, when you own a dry goods store, you don't just sort of sell it and you're done in a week. He began, at least then, he began the long process of calling in debts owed to him by putting notices in the Sangamo Journal, and those began in late August. So that's how we know for sure that he had made this decision and proceeded and continued throughout the fall, as well as making all the arrangements with his then clerk Charles Hurst for the actual sale of the store. And the notice of the sale of the store, which meant the separation from Lincoln, appeared in the local paper on January 1, 1841. This friend who had helped stabilize him in his moratorium of delayed identity formation was now leaving him. Lincoln was unmoored, alone, lost. In that confused state, which he barely understood himself, Lincoln withdrew from Mary and broke off the engagement. After what he would call his fatal first, he became deeply and clinically depressed and definitely suicidal. He took to his bed at the home of William Butler. His friends, including Speed, removed his razor and other sharp objects from the room and set up a kind of suicide watch, as they had done at New Salem 6 years earlier. Lincoln became wild and unhinged, hallucinated, which is often occurs in clinical depression, stopped working and became crazy as a loon, in the words of Orville Browning, who was also staying in the home at the time. And Jane Bell wrote a contemporary letter, and she said Lincoln, quote, came within an inch of becoming a perfect lunatic for life. Speed actually didn't return to Kentucky right away, probably remaining in Springfield to help nurture his friend back to health. But finally, in June 1841, Speed did leave, but not without extracting a promise that Lincoln would visit him in Louisville that summer. That visit occurred in late August and September for 3 weeks, when Lincoln stayed at Farmington, the Speed plantation just outside Louisville. He was assigned a boy to attend to his needs. And actually, I think it's been insignificantly noted that this is far and away Lincoln's most extended experience, direct experience with slavery, that visit to Farmington in the late summer of 1841. In that context, with the friends together taking long walks and talking to each other and sharing things again, and when they could be safe and secure with each other, Speed suddenly fell in love with and became engaged to Fanny Henning, whom Lincoln called beautiful black-eyed Fanny. Seemingly out of nowhere, within a matter of 10 days, Speed fell in love with Fanny and became engaged. Speed also instantly became depressed. Having done it, he became depressed and felt some of what he later called the same nonsense as Lincoln earlier in the year. In his own panic, Speed decided to return to Springfield with Lincoln rather than stay in Louisville, get the family business back together, and proceed with his marriage to Fanny. Lincoln and Speed spent the fall together, probably in the store again, although I don't know that for sure. But on January 1, 1842, an important anniversary for Lincoln, Speed left to return to Louisville and marriage to Fanny. He couldn't put it off any longer. Now, in that January and February of 1842, Lincoln wrote the most revealing letters of his life, personal letters, to his friend in the lead up to and just after Speed's marriage. He talked of Speed's fears for Fanny's illness and death, of his uncertain love, in ways that vicariously expressed his own feelings. That is to note, we don't have Speed's letters in return. The culmination of the correspondence and the emotional turning point in the life of Abraham Lincoln came in his letter of February 25th, 1842. On February 24th, Lincoln opened a letter from Speed in which he reported on his marriage to Fanny Henning. Lincoln wrote his friend the next day, "I received yours of the 12th, written the day you went down to Williams's place some days since, but delayed answering it till I should receive the promised one of the 16th, which came last night. I opened the latter with intense anxiety and trepidation, so much that although it turned out better than I expected, I have hardly yet at the distance of 10 hours become calm." This was the consummation letter. Speed got married on February 15th, and clearly he had promised Lincoln that as soon as he possibly could, after consummating his marriage, he would write to report on its outcome. Speed, it seems, had barely tumbled out of his wedding bed on the morning of February 16th before he wrote Lincoln. In fact, even though, quote, "it turned out better than I expected," as Lincoln wrote, the next day he still was not calm at the distance of 10 hours. That's a long time for a man then 33 years of age to be experiencing such anxiety from the news of how his 27-year-old friend's wedding night turned out. Lincoln made Speed his vicarious substitute in the courtship of Fanny Henning. Through Speed, he could work through his tormented fears of intimacy. The marriage Lincoln makes his own indirect realization. The relief is palpable for Lincoln. Quote, "I tell you, Speed, our forebodings, for which you and I are rather peculiar, are all the worst sort of nonsense." He then recounts the dreaded passing of the days for him in his letter of February 25th as he awaited news of the February 15th wedding, with an obsessive-compulsive intensity punctuated by gratuitous underlinings. Lincoln wrote, "I fancied from the time I received your letter of Saturday that the one of Wednesday was never to come, and yet it did come. And what is more, it is perfectly clear, both from its tone and handwriting, that you were much happier, or if you think the term preferable, less miserable, when you wrote it, than when you wrote the last one before. You had so obviously improved at the very time I so much feared you would have grown worse." It's not only funny, it's tortured and confused, and the grammar is off and everything. But a shadow remains. Lincoln goes on, "You say that, quote, something indescribably horrible and alarming still haunts you. You will not say that 3 months from now, I will venture. When your nerves once get steady now, the whole trouble will be over forever. Nor should you become impatient at their even being very slow in becoming steady. Again, you say you much fear that that Elysium of which you have dreamed so much is never to be realized. Well, if it shall not, I dare swear it will not be the fault of her who is now your wife. I now have no doubt that it is the peculiar misfortune of both you and me to dream dreams of Elysium far exceeding all that anything earthly can realize." The perplexing line in the letter, you say that something indescribably horrible and alarming still haunts you, suggests Speed felt great relief at his ability to carry out sexual intercourse with Fanny, but remained troubled that the sky did not suddenly clear and the heavens part. Lincoln at first seems not to be particularly worried about Speed's feeling that something, quote, indescribably horrible still haunted him, writing with confidence, quote, "You will not say that 3 months from now." But Lincoln cannot entirely dismiss Speed's fear that his dreams of Elysium would never be realized. Lincoln's argument addressing these concerns in this section of the letter is somewhat elliptical. On the one hand, he is confident that Speed's fears will fade in due time based on the most welcome news that the marriage consummation went well. As long as that is over, things have to improve, and Speed's anxiety will gradually dissipate. It would seem the message from Speed was, things went well, but I still feel bad. Lincoln's encouragement of Speed, on the other hand, reflects some ambivalence for Speed's continued doubts that, given his identification with his friend, poses the danger of circling back onto himself. Lincoln gently chastises Speed and tells him his unhappiness lingers from his nervous temperament and that, quote, will not be the fault of her who is now your wife. But perhaps feeling bad for this subtle criticism, Lincoln immediately returns to his identification with Speed and affirms their common experience with emotional problems. In that imagined joy, however, lies a contradiction. Speed's marriage to Fanny means he will never again be available in the same total way for Lincoln. Speed is now joined with Fanny, forever apart. Lincoln had been as much attuned empathically with Speed as with anyone in his life, or would be with anyone else. He was completely immersed in Speed's inner life. Nothing matches in intimacy that kind of connection with another. To lose it leaves one feeling lost and alone, abandoned, despairing. Speed's marriage, for all the joy it brings Lincoln and Speed, is simultaneously a moment of dreaded loss, even a kind of symbolic death. In his triumphant experience of love, Speed categorically abandons his friend, though Lincoln tries mightily to relish Speed's new love. On the other hand, it seems in Speed's marriage to Fanny Henning that Lincoln found indirect resolution of his own confusions over intimacy. Lincoln was free then to resume his courtship of Mary Todd, who had graciously waited for him to wrestle his demons to the ground. In a sense, losing Speed allowed Lincoln to regain Mary. After a quiet courtship so as not to stir the gossip mill, they married that fall on November 4th. In a letter to a colleague some 10 days later, Lincoln adds, "Nothing new here except my marrying, which to me is a matter of profound wonder." Thank you.
We have the house lights up, and we welcome your comments. Chuck and I will sit here. There will be microphones at either aisle, so please raise your hand, and Dale or Sabrina will bring you a microphone, correct? Okay. Good, thank you. Any questions to start? There are a number that could be.
There's one.
Yes, right down front here. Please wait for the microphone to reach you.
Do you have any thoughts on what Lincoln's life might have been if he had married Anne Rutledge had she lived?
You know, in history we try to avoid what's called counterfactual history because it can become so hypothetical and sort of spin off into space. But it is an interesting question about whether it would have resolved some of these issues over intimacy at a much earlier stage. I mean, one of the things about this moratorium that Lincoln was entered into sometime in his 20s, when he just couldn't get things straight. He couldn't get his career on track. He couldn't get love on track, was that it delayed the resolution of those basic issues of solving an identity, a usable identity for himself. And the delay itself aggravated developmentally those psychological issues for himself. And so by the time Speed comes into the picture, Speed helps soothe him in their connection and their affection and even their love, certainly their enduring friendship. But it also continued to prolong it. So, you know, he was in his early 30s when he really began when he got engaged with Mary, and then of course broke it off and went through a torment and felt terrible about himself and felt sorry for Mary, and then only worked it through with Speed. So your question, you know, 1835, 34, if Anne had not died and they had married, he probably would have continued on his professional path, but would he have been happier earlier? interesting possibility.
Yes, here.
Joshua Speed and Lincoln split or had a over the issue of slavery, and yet Lincoln still takes his brother on as Attorney General later on. Can you maybe talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that, I didn't talk in this little talk, but I follow through the relationship. I mean, what happened to the Speed friendship. And, they remained friends for the rest of their lives. It's just that very quickly after February 25th, which I say is that's the emotional turning point in the life of Abraham Lincoln. And it certainly is the turning point in the friendship with Joshua Speed. The texture of the closeness, of the intimacy begins to fade away. Now, of course, Speed is left within a year. He's gone in Louisville. But even then, and Lincoln was handling, I mentioned how difficult it was to leave, for Speed to leave, because he had to calling all these deaths, and the way you ran a store was really very elaborate and prolonged the financial dealings. And so after 1842 until 1848, there were still suits and judgments had to be gotten, and Lincoln was handling most of those legal cases. Actually, what Lincoln did after he started 1844, when he was a law partner with Herndon, is he foisted all that stuff off on Herndon. He said, "You take care of it." Well, Herndon didn't take very good care of it. So in 1846, there's an angry letter that, again, we don't have Speed's letter. We only have Lincoln's reply. Speed clearly wrote an angry letter, like, "Get with it. I need this case settled. I got to get this money," or whatever. And Lincoln wrote back, basically addressing the tone of anger, which was so unusual in his dear friend, and said, "It is sad to see a friendship like ours die by degrees." Pretty poignant line that Lincoln wrote in 1846. After that, they really didn't have much to do with one another until the very famous letter in 1855, when Lincoln was just emerging as the spokesperson really for the new emerging ideas in the Republican Party, the emerging Republican Party, about slavery. And he was not known nationally yet, but he was certainly known in Illinois and in the Midwest for the positions that he was taking. After 1854, he suddenly burst on the scene because he could understand it, he could make it his own, he could articulate what it meant. But he wrote Speed had written him clearly a letter saying, where do you stand on this issue of slavery and the extension of slavery into the territories? And he was troubled. He kind of wanted to know where Lincoln stood, and whatever else he said. Lincoln replied in very sharp tones, saying, again, I've always felt slavery is terrible. I particularly now am appalled at the extension of slavery. It has to be a basic point. We have to take a stand on not allowing slavery to extend. And why don't people like you, who I know basically have a good heart, and I know don't like slavery, but you're bound to it because you're a Southerner and you're a slave owner. And Speed continued to be a slave owner, not as large as his father, but he tended to own quite a few slaves, actually. But you're, in the tradition of like Henry Clay, sort of the liberal Southern slave owners. And I know you oppose the extension of slavery, but nobody like you ever speaks up. And that's the letter where he ends by saying, I'm going to, rather than have to deal with the base hypocrisy of the know-nothings, I would rather to accept, sort of the racism and the anti-immigrant, which we've heard some of recently, right? I would rather go to Russia, he says, and where I don't have to take my hypocrisy unalloyed. So that was tension. They still didn't, they never broke in friendship. And toward the election, 1859, 1860, 1859, Speed wrote him and said, come to Louisville and watch the horse races, and Lincoln didn't go. They never visited. And 1860, though, Speed wrote him a letter. Again, we only have Lincoln's response, so you have to infer what the letter is. But basically, it's pretty clear from Lincoln's response. What Speed wrote was congratulating him on being nominated to be president, but making it clear that he wasn't going to vote for him. Which is very surprising. I must say that he said, I really respect you. You're a great man, and you'll be a great president if you're elected, but I'm not going to vote for you. Then he did vote for him in 1864, by the way. Then during the war, after he was elected, the second person Lincoln tried to get into his cabinet was Joshua Speed. People don't make enough of the significance. Obviously, William Seward was first, Secretary of State, but he called Speed and Fannie Henning to go for a special meeting in Chicago, and they met at Tremont House, and he asked Speed sort of how you're doing financially, and Speed understood right away what he was talking about, and basically Speed said, I'm making too much money to be Secretary of the Treasury. I think there were other things. He didn't want to be that upfront supporting the Republicans, but Lincoln wanted a liberal Southerner to be in the cabinet. Politically, that would have been very useful for Lincoln, and who better than his old best friend, Joshua Speed. Speed, by the way, became an enormously successful businessman in Louisville. Enormous, left an estate of equivalent of $17 million when he died. He was he owned hotels and banks and railroads. I mean, he was really he wasn't a Vanderbilt kind of guy, but he was very successful. And Lincoln wanted him to be Secretary of the Treasury. He didn't. He then played a role in the summer and fall of keeping, he was a gun runner. So when there was all these fights in Kentucky, pro and con the dissolution of the Union, and he went to Washington and got authorization from Lincoln to buy 100,000 guns, which he then distributed to the pro-Union Kentuckians. So he played a role in keeping Kentucky in the Union. At least, Lincoln said, I hope I have God on my side, but I have to have Kentucky. And then later, Speed often went to the White House and they visited, and he never played a political role after that. But it was important for Lincoln, and they would talk and muse, and really a number of visits.
Chuck, can I
You
point out
certainly may.
something?
I'll shut up.
Well, no, one thing that you aren't aware of yet, and the world will soon eventually be aware of through the Papers of Abraham Lincoln project that's run here with all these incoming requests for jobs and recommendations for people in the cabinet. There are a lot of people who come through Speed to get to Lincoln
Yes.
for appointments in Kentucky in
Yes.
the latter half of the presidency. Actually, both halves, but it's more evident later on. And so Speed did play a political role, but behind the scenes. He was connected to the people that Lincoln wanted running the state.
No, he definitely, and he did. He wrote a lot. He was always trying to get jobs for his relationship. I'll be interested in a lot already are available, but I'll be interested when these get processed. Yeah.
I think there was a question down.
Yes, thank you. We know that Lincoln had his unholies, and that he came through them to them honestly through his forebears, through his relatives. They too had Great Depression. But I'm wondering, putting the two times together, our modern times and the earlier times, was this very common among young men, feeling the feelings of inadequacy and intimacy, fear of intimacy? To your knowledge, was this not unusual for Speed and Lincoln?
Right. Yes, it was not unusual, even common. Let me sort of broaden that question a little bit. There's been a lot of work on the history of female friendship and lesbianism, and we've just recently that work started in the early 1970s, so it's like 40 years old, and done really uncovered some very interesting things about the history of women and female friendships, and also the history of lesbianism. There's just beginning, maybe in the last 10 years, serious historical work on the history of homosexuality, which is very important work to be done. I learned a lot from it. I've immersed myself in it, and secret archives of men holding hands with pictures and kissing and really interesting kind of stuff, sort of totally suppressed because it was so forbidden, so verboten, right? But what I'm interested in is the way in which the culture dealt with people like Lincoln and Speed, who were inclined to want to reach out to women and be with women and love women and make families with women, and how the texture in the 19th century, how the texture of their friendship was so different from the way it is now. So that now if two men sleep together and talk about how their forever friendship, they probably are presenting themselves to the world as homosexuals. And that's what it means in the present context. In the 19th century, that wasn't true at all. And what seemed to, unlike with female friendships, they tended to make their dear friendships in adolescence, when they were in school or whatever. And then they lasted a lifetime. So that they would, later on they'd have a baby and their friend would come and they would kick the husband out of the bed and he would have to sleep on the couch. And there's some wonderful letters that have been discovered along these lines. And then she would help with maybe with the birth and very long, and come back again and visit later the next year and on into old age, the female friendships. With men, it was like that, but it was, first of all, it's more guarded. Maybe men are generally more guarded. They're not as open. They're not going to, Lincoln and Speed didn't kiss on Fifth Street. So there was none of that sort of effusive expression of intimacy and affection. And also, it had a different place. And I think in this sense, this is why the Lincoln Speed friendship is really a paradigmatic male friendship. And really, you can learn a lot from it. And I think it's very important to extend this kind of knowledge out to other men and to think about it in the contemporary era. With men, it tended to, the friendships, exactly as Speed and Lincoln, tended to be between mother and wife, tended to be in that narrative space in the life cycle after they left home, after they left the mother. But before, and marriage would often be extended, as with Lincoln and Speed, into the late 20s, early 30s. And that's when they became close friends with men. And then once they married, then they tended to part. Then it tended not to endure for long after that. So I think there's, I'm sort of hoping this will set off a new scholarship, people thinking about some of these friendships in different ways. I spoke at NYU, you mentioned, a few weeks ago, and Martha Hood was there, and she's very interesting, done some interesting kind of social history work, and I think we have much more to learn about this. And male friendship, of course, matter. We care about male friendship now. It matters. Men, because men delayed, men, they go to college and then they come home and they sleep on your couch for the next 10 years, right? And, they hang out with their men and maybe they date, but they really, what matters most in their lives are their friendships with other men and, bromance. And all these sort of things are changing dramatically right now. And that sort of makes the question like, well, what was it like earlier? What's the history of male friendship? And how can we begin, what can we learn from the history of male friendship?
So Dale can see right in the middle there.
Just like this? Oh, I have several questions, if I may.
One, one per customer, please.
Okay. Well, let's see. Which one should I ask? Well, let's see.
Go ahead.
Just choose one out of the hat.
Okay. All right. Why is the Matilda Edwards theory discounted?
Matilda. Well, that's one of the, I mentioned there are four major lines of interpretation that differ with me. And as I say, I've been reading these books for the last 30 years, and needless to say, I felt they were all wrong, which is why I spent writing this, right? The Matilda thesis is very simple. Matilda was a beautiful young woman, 18 years old. She received 22 offers of marriage. She was a cousin of Ninian Edwards. She came and lived in the home, in the Edwards home, when Mary was living there as well. And she arrived in November 1840, just within a month before Lincoln broke off his engagement with Mary. And the supposition is that he must have fallen in love with Matilda, and therefore that's why he broke off the engagement with Mary. That explanation for the broken engagement was part of the Springfield rumor mill. People who were not in the home, who were not in Lincoln, were not close to it. So it became a kind of a de facto story. And some indication, there's even some indication that that in the moment of breaking it off, although it's a very confused narrative about really what really happened when Lincoln went to break off the engagement, he was going to write a letter to Mary to break the engagement. And Speed said, "You're a coward if you write a letter. You got to go tell her." And it was unmanly. That was his word. So, calling him unmanly was convinced Lincoln he had to go talk to her. But what actually transpired is unknown. She may have mentioned in that encounter, Matilda, and then he let her have, I think, out of goodness, because he felt so bad about breaking it off, he let her have that explanation. And then it got into the rumor mill and stuff. But the best evidence against it, well, there are two pieces of evidence. One is, and it's a very convenient theory. So he's got he's all confused young man. Beautiful Matilda walks into his line of vision, and he says, I love Matilda, so I'll break it off with Mary. Right? There are two big problems. One is that Matilda and Mary continued to live together for the next year in the Edwards home. And Mary, who was not one to let her feelings not be known, I can imagine that if in fact that had been the real cause, Elizabeth Edwards, who was really a critical witness in all this, she was older than Mary, she was husband of Ninian, she lived in the house, she had Mary living there, she understood what her younger sister was all about, she understood what Matilda was all about, and she later said, and she had a number of interviews with Herndon in the oral history, she later said, it's nonsense, it had nothing to do with the breakup. And she furthermore specifically interviewed in that next year before Matilda married Strong and left the house, she actually went out of her way to interview, she told Herndon later, she went out of her way to interview Matilda and asked whether Lincoln had ever, sort of made advances and tried to court her. And she said, "He never even stooped to pay me a compliment." Those are her exact words. "He never even stooped to pay me a compliment." Now, the problem is Matilda died in 1850, so Herndon couldn't interview her. So what Elizabeth Edwards says, she said, is really the best piece of evidence we have. I think those are two pretty good pieces of evidence about something that is always going to be elusive, particularly given all this other part of the story, the narrative that is with Speed, that I think is so much more compelling.
One more there.
I don't recall ever hearing very much at all about Mary Lincoln's opinion of Speed. Is there much in the writings or in Mary's letters or whatever? What did Mary think of all this friendship with Speed?
Interesting question. I mean, one of the things I focused in when I talked about, their friendship and focused on Lincoln. But and this is not a dual biography, but I bring Speed out of the shadows. I did a lot of work on Speed. I worked on all of his letters in Kentucky and Filson at the Kentucky Historical Society, and had a lot of people helping me there. And he and also Mary's letters, which of course have been published, so you can see them and you read them. She was very fond of Speed. And remember, Speed was the one who first introduced Lincoln to Mary. Speed was, he'd been educated, raised on a plantation. He was Southern aristocrat. He was very elegant. He knew how to dance. He could banter. He wasn't. Elizabeth Edwards said that Lincoln, as a young man, was peculiar. Now, not sure what he meant, but he was uneasy. He didn't like to dance. He felt, sort of unsteady, and he certainly was not at his best at the coterie, where Elizabeth and Ninian would greet their guests in French, and the violins would be playing in the back, and they would be dancing the polonaise and whatever, and the waltz. Speed was totally at ease in that kind of environment. He could dance, he could talk, he could flirt. he was very much, he was a particular favorite of Ninian Edwards, and who was very, the son of the territorial governor and later governor and senator from Illinois. And Ninian actually wanted Speed to marry Mary Todd. He tried to set them up. There's no indication that Speed was ever interested in that or that Mary was interested in Speed. But she was very fond of Speed. And there are lots of references in June 1840 and other letters in this period. There are often references to Speed. It often appears in the oral history. So there's no indication that Mary felt at all threatened by the closeness between Lincoln and Speed once Mary and Lincoln had fallen in love. She saw Speed as a supporter of the relationship, which he was by all indication. And she, there's some letters once he went back to Kentucky, actually, after June 1841, when Speed went back to Kentucky. There's some letters that Mary wrote separately to Speed, just as a friend, whom she had known and was very, very fond of.
Could you comment related to that, Chuck? There is the whisper of the possibility that when Abraham and Mary's first child is expected, that if a boy, he will be named Joshua.
It was more than a whisper.
And
it's in a
then-
letter. It's in a Lincoln wrote. He said your Joshua is about to come when Mary was like 5 or 6 months pregnant.
Yeah.
Now,
But
it was named Robert.
what's interesting, given comments you made a moment ago, if their second boy, Edward Baker Lincoln, had been born a year, maybe 2 earlier than he was, he could have been named Joshua because Mary claimed the first son to be named for her father. Seemed perfectly fair. Robert Todd Lincoln. And yet, it's this failing by William Herndon to collect enough of Speed's debts in 1844 and 45 that creates the tension
Yes.
in that 1846 letter. And little Eddie is born in
Right.
March of 1846.
Exactly.
So
exactly.
what if little Joshua Lincoln had come into the world in 1845, let's say?
More counterfactual history.
More
right?
counterfactual.
Right. No, of course, no, that's exactly right. I completely agree with that. But, the first child, Robert, was supposed to be Joshua. And Mary clearly overruled that and made sure that it would be Robert, not Joshua. But by the time the second boy was born, he had already separated the relationship. It hadn't disintegrated, but it had lost its texture of intimacy. And so it doesn't seem that he ever really even, there's no reference I've ever seen where Lincoln even considered naming the second son Joshua. Yeah, no, that's a good point.
Anyone else? Yes. Yeah.
Excuse me.
So from this discussion, am I taking that Lincoln, you're saying, was celibate until his marriage? And in that, or was it just his uncomfortableness with the higher society?
You can imagine that there are a number of people who disagree with me on this. Yes, I think so. I have a whole chapter on sex and prostitution. The tales, you see what's happened after I published my book in 1982, where I had this, it was really just wasn't even a whole chapter, it was a part of a chapter on the friendship. And it stirred, on the one hand, all of the gay Lincoln stuff. And people, book after book after book, making up through Larry Kramer last year, making the tendentious argument without any support that just because 2 men slept together, therefore they must have been sexualized. But that in turn, that literature aroused the high testosterone Lincoln story. And Matilda is central to that line of argument. Also is anti-Mary. It's a very curious sort of set of threads that have come together. Some of the recent writing on Mary Todd Lincoln has been as negative as anything I've ever seen since Herndon, and really unfair, wrong. I mean, you know, there was, she was troubled as she aged, her children died, and you know, you have to, as a young woman, Lincoln loved her, he adored her, and particularly the first decade of their marriage when they had their children, it was a very loving kind of relationship. But anyway, the argument sort of demeaning Mary, raising up the significance, and I think creating the significance of Matilda, is in the context of also resurrecting some old tales from Herndon about prostitutes and the Beardstown girls, and I mean all the stories, and going to farmers' daughters and doing illicit things with farmers' daughters. I mean, some of the most just, Herndon was a very hard worker in collecting the oral history. He completely lacked a sense of humor. He completely lacked a sense of humor. And if anybody in American history has had a sense of humor, it's Abraham Lincoln. And he was 9 years younger, and Lincoln loved to tease him. He loved to tease him. And I mean, one of the most interesting examples, because it's so well documented, is Lincoln in 1849 went to see Niagara Falls. And he came back and he wrote a fragment that's in the collected works, you know, in his hand, about the amazing, and the falls were here when Jesus was born and John the Baptist was baptized, and through the millennia the falls have been coming, you know, just sort of very effusive and kind of romantic reaction. What Herndon wrote, Herndon asked him, and this is in a letter, and later he wrote after the war. Herndon said, well, you went to Niagara Falls. What did you think, Mr. Lincoln? And Lincoln looked at him and he said, well, I have to tell you, I wondered where all that water came from. He's toying with Herndon. And I think the stories, if you unpack kind of when Herndon, like going to the prostitute where he paid the $5, and then he would charge $5 and he only had $3, and he got undressed, and the prostitute was willing to give him credit, but he said, well, I don't have the credit, so woe is me, and he put his clothes back on and left. This is one of the, well, for one thing, if there's any truth to the anecdote, it proves that Lincoln did not end up being with a prostitute. But what really, it's clearly a joke. Herndon has it in his notes in 1889, and he reports that he heard it from Speed. Well, Speed died in 1882, so he couldn't have heard it as an old man from Speed. He must have heard it back in 1841 or 39 or whenever. And clearly, and then he remembered it for half a century before he wrote it down. He thought it was so risque, he could never write it down. So 50 years later, he finally writes it down. And what probably happened is that Lincoln told a joke, and Speed didn't get it. And about a prostitute, it's a pretty funny, stupid story about a prostitute. Well, it's entered into the literature now that the ground was littered with women that Lincoln dated, and all these prostitutes. But if you look at each story, each anecdote carefully, and I did, it was important to understand this. I think they're totally spurious. I think they're Lincoln jokes that Herndon didn't get. So yes, I think he and Speed were both virgins. Now, I can't prove that. How could you write a letter like, how could you be, at 33 years of age, right when you hear of your best friend's consummation of his marriage? My hands are not, I'm not calm yet after 10 hours. 10 hours is a long time. It's a long time, right? So that's my guess. Now, it's been pointed out, and I think it's true, you can be deeply troubled about intimacy and not necessarily be a virgin. That's true. So nevertheless, it seems to me, read that letter, it's an extraordinary letter. February 25th, 1842.
Could you tell us about Joshua Speed's reaction to the assassination of Lincoln, and did he attend the funeral or join the Lincoln family in any way during this time?
He was devastated. He did not go to the funeral, but he did respond immediately to Herndon's request for interviews and letters, and he tried to help Herndon as much as possible in gathering material for his oral history. He was very closely involved. It's really quite abundant. sort of Speed's testimony. And he did 1865, 66, 67, and then continuing into the early 1870s. And then in the mid-1870s, he wrote his reminiscences, sort of his autobiography, about basically his experiences with Lincoln. And so he treasured this closeness and this friendship. And he wanted to try to share as much as possible. He recognized that it was, he was not a major player in history, but he was part of something that was quite monumental. I think it's amazing that no one has really written about this. I mean, people have been, for 150 years, people have been writing books about Lincoln, and they all say, isn't it interesting that Lincoln had this close friend, Joshua Speed? But nobody has really, first of all, they haven't gone back and read Speed's letters and done the work at Filson, but I think it's because they don't have the psychological wherewithal to comprehend how complicated this relationship was. That wasn't sexualized, but it was a loving, close friendship. And you have to be able to keep more than one thing in your head at the same time, I think, to understand the friendship of.
Let me just stick up in defense for the general ignorance of the topic. It's partly Herndon's fault. Herndon, who truly felt that he was Lincoln's closest friend, says over and over, no one understood Lincoln the way I did. I knew the man from 1836, no 1835, no 1834. The older he gets, the earlier he was his best friend. He even actually writes once, I knew Lincoln from 1834 to 1866. Just kept.
Right.
So we owe Herndon a lot, and he was oblivious, apparently, to the letters and to the friendship of Speed. So other people have been following Herndon's lead, maybe. But
yeah, I suspect that.
Maybe not
I
oblivious.
suspect that Herndon, well, it was sort of some evidence, but not to be tentative in phrasing this, but I suspect that what Herndon felt, particularly when he was living up there in the dorm above the store and sleeping in the other bed, I suspect what he felt was intense envy at the closeness that Lincoln and Speed had, because Herndon wanted that kind of closeness with Lincoln, and he never had it. Lincoln actually made fun of him as that Niagara story, and I think if that just happens to be particularly well documented, his reaction to Niagara. But he did that. He must have constantly mocked him, and he was the perfect person to mock, because he was so serious and so earnest, and wrote, if you ever read his letters, frantic, breathless prose with dashes and adjectives and underlinings and trying to always get the truth and argue for what he believed in and what was true. And he never had nuance or subtlety, and most of all, never had humor, which Speed did. Speed got him. And he got Speed. And I think Herndon, if anything, was deeply envious of that. And Herndon, maybe, and I don't know, maybe you'll come up with some documents. I think maybe Herndon kind of wrote Speed out of the story as a result. He wrote too much about Mary, maligning Mary, domestic hell and crazy and all that kind of stuff. He wrote much too much about Mary, because he had an axe to grind, and he had a grudge against Mary. But then he underwrote Speed, and he knew how significant Speed was for Lincoln.
I think we have time for one more question, because there is still time before 8 o'clock that you can go outside and chat with people a bit more and sign books. I hope I'm not squeezing things down here.
I'll go on for the next 3 or 4 hours.
Well, much as we'd like to.
One of the individuals in Lincoln's story who has risen and fallen, depending on the interpretive analysis of historians, has been Anne Rutledge. And some people have said that she has been overemphasized in importance in Lincoln's life, and have dismissed or undercut her significance. Others have said that she was crucial to him, and you seem to have taken the latter opinion. Could you talk a little bit about the rise and fall of Anne Rutledge and the rise again, and why you came out where you did on that, Chuck.
Right. No, it's an interesting history. The people tended, going back to the 1950s, and there were a couple of historians who simply didn't trust the Anne Rutledge as the great love of his life, and they particularly didn't trust the account that Herndon wrote up, starting with a lecture he gave in Springfield in 1866, and then later as a theme in his book, in what Donald called 3 ridiculous little volumes in 1889. The idea that Lincoln always loved Anne, and that her death was tragic for him, and that's why he never loved Mary, and that's why Mary was crazy. So that's Herndon's argument in a nutshell. And that turned off people, because then you had some romantic paintings and poems, and you have Lincoln at the grave of Anne beating his heart on his chest, and the pouring rain, and oh, the great love. You know, it became a story that fit into 19th century romantic stories of death and loss and love. And that turned off people, particularly in the middle of the century, for 50s, 60s, 70s. The problem was they really had not read the documentary record. And the documentary record, that is the oral history, which was chaotic and very difficult to read, was returned to first by a guy named John Y. Simon, who's a great Grant scholar, back in the 70s, and then somewhat later by Douglas Wilson, who of course has been the great editor of the Herndon material. And they both, you know, John, who I knew well, and Doug went back and they read more carefully what people said about Anne. And there's no question that Lincoln absolutely adored her. And everybody, every letter, every account, at least 16 different accounts, people refer to this, and to how devastated he was when she died. So it was a very serious relationship. He loved her, and he was betrothed to her when she suddenly and tragically died. Now, and I think that's the history that now is generally accepted. So I think there's been a sequence that really recognized from underestimating the significance of Anne to now appreciating her role in New Salem.
Oh, let's have one more.
You're a pushover, right?
One.
I think what you've done is very significant. And the reason I'm saying that is that men often are only realized as important because of their wives, that their wives are what make a man really great. But I think we're forgetting all the friendships that they make in their lives and how important those are in a man becoming a great person. And so I think it's a wonderful thing that you've done with this friendship, is bringing it out into the open like this and let people really appreciate it for what it is.
Yeah. Thank you. I do, particularly for someone, that's sort of why it's paradigmatic as a male friendship, and it kind of opens up the need to recognize how significant friendship can be. I've always wondered, and I have no way of answering this question, but I think it's a question that's worth thinking about, whether Lincoln really developed the same kind of textured intimacy with Mary that he had with Speed. I don't know. He loved Mary, there's no question about it. He was close to her, particularly in the first decade. But was there that openness, that acknowledgement of feelings and when he felt despair? I don't know. You know, it certainly was the case with Speed, which is why we need to tell the story of Speed.
Ladies and gentlemen, let us have a round of applause for our speakers.
Thank you all.
And we'll be back out front and perhaps bump into you again there.